More than 160,000 Harris supporters joined one single Zoom call. That's the most ever. In fact, the company said its engineers had to get involved to avoid a crash. That call was rallying white women for Harris.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. Welcome to 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. It is day 83 days until the election. My guest today is Betsy Hodges. She is the former mayor of Minneapolis and currently a writer and consultant around white people and racial equity. She is also, just coincidentally, a really good friend of mine. Hey, Betsy.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
I'm all right. I've been doing better lately. Something has changed in the vibe, the general national vibe. I don't know if you've noticed.
You know, I have. I am a Minnesotan, so if I hadn't noticed before Tim Walz became the nominee, I have noticed since.
Yeah, I sent you a text asking if you were enjoying like all the Minnesota memes and all the Minnesota love. And I want to talk about Minnesota. There's two main things I want to talk to you about. One is the real meaning of Minnesota nice.
Yes.
And also, I want to talk to you about white women for Kamala, because this is what you've been doing for the past, how many years?
30 plus.
Yeah. I was just going to do the post-mayor of Minneapolis part.
Whoa, yeah.
But yeah, you've been educating and working in racial equity for a very long time. And it is always important, but it's peaked back into the national consciousness with the success of these organizing calls for white people and Kamala. And maybe I'll start there. I thought of you immediately when I saw these calls burst into the scene, because one of the things that you introduced me to was the importance of just talking about whiteness, not just talking about quote unquote diversity and educating white people about Blackness or people of color, but turning the mirror around.
Yes. Part of the challenge of a lot of racial equity work is that we, as white people, are socialized into thinking of it as charity. It's sort of inside the dynamics of race in America that white people see it as a zero-sum game. Heather McGhee talks about that a great deal in her book, The Sum of Us. And so this idea that there's nothing in it for white people, and it's just this thing we do out of the goodness of our hearts to give up and cede some of the great stuff we've gotten from being white, and then we give a little bit of that to people of the global majority. That model is inside the problem, because there is something in it for white people to do this work. And we get to do this work. It's actually very good for us on any realm you want to take a look at for us to do it. And so, yes, but one of the first things we have to overcome to even make the case that it's good for us is we have to be able to say whiteness. We have to be able to name race, that we have a race. We have one, just like everybody has one under our current social system. And usually when I do that, I also have to tell the white people in the room that it's okay to take a deep breath. It's pretty taboo to name it.
Yeah. Someone I was talking to called it cringy, which that's part of the oppression, though, right? Like that's part of the problem, is that we don't want to, don't talk about whiteness. Whiteness, we shouldn't be talking about ourselves. We should put the focus on them.
Yes. Right. Exactly. Right. That's inside also thinking there's a what do you call it? There's a flaw in the logic about we should put people of the global majority in charge of solving racism, white people's racism. Like, of course, that partnership is incredibly important. Most of what we know about how whiteness functions in the world comes from the experience shared by people of the global majority. But, to expect them to lead us out of it all by themselves is inherently illogical, given the way that we are socialized as white people to think about people of color.
This is the first time that I can remember people talking so openly about white people for XYZ, and unironically, right? Like there was a lot of memeing around how much white people liked Obama. But I've never seen organizing calls and sort of straightforward recognition that this is something that we have to talk about when we talk about white people supporting a non-white person in office. Have you seen that before? Obviously, like, this must happen. No?
I haven't seen it like this. Surge exists. The organization Surge exists, SURJ, run by a great woman named Erin Heaney. And they did the first call that I was on, I think the next day or the day after Vice President Harris became the presumptive nominee. And so they've been out there doing this work, and I'm glad, because when the moment came, they're able to really do some important organizing. But I'm so excited to see white people for white women, white men, white dudes, I think they call themselves, all of it. And that's very exciting to me, because it means there's a hurdle that at some point, I would say in the last 5 years, we all got over that. It hadn't been clear to me we'd gotten over. It's very exciting.
So what kinds of things do people need to know when they're on those calls? What are they learning? As a white person supporting Kamala and Walz, like, what should I be thinking about or be aware of?
Well, that's really interesting, because I also am doing my own series of Zooms, webinars, classes, whatever you want to call them, for white women in specific, because what's happening on these big calls is very important, right? It's saying it's an open invitation for white people to show up to, we're at the plate, now let's take a swing, right? We're at bat, let's take a swing on behalf of Vice President Harris and Tim Walz. Let's really do what needs doing there. Here's what it can look like. Organizing is important. And often they go over the history, particularly for white women, that white women, for the most part, vote for the Republican candidate for president. And that's been true for the last 50, 75 years, with the exception of Clinton 2 and Obama 1. And so it's important to say, hey, white women, we have to show up. We have to go get other white women and bring them in. And that's all important. And what I think is missing from that space sometimes, and what I offered too, is, okay, but there are reasons that white women often show up to the plate but don't take a swing. That we have the value of racial equity, we have the value of electing a Black woman president, but we don't have the skills or the understanding that we need about what would get in the way of us personally taking action. What do I mean by that? It's things like, it's a feature, not a bug, of the white racial identity, how we're socialized, to feel like we are clueless. Right?
Okay. All right. Talk a little more about that.
Yeah. It's, you can see all the memes, or, comedians make jokes about it, as they should, right? White people show up, it's like, well, we don't know what to do. And, people, the global majority, are like, what do you mean? We've been telling you for 400 years exactly what to do. You know what to do. We're asking you to go door knock, right? We're asking you to make a phone call. We're asking you to bring people along in your workplace, whatever it is, that is the clear action that we can take, but we hesitate to take those actions. And there's reasons for that. The first barrier to entry is, no matter how much we learn, no matter how many books we've read since George Floyd was murdered, many of us still feel, it's a feeling, we feel like we don't know enough and we're ignorant. We think there's some set of racial equity skills that people of color have that we as white people do not have and somehow cannot learn. And I am here to say there is no set of special racial equity skills. They're just human skills. They're just human skills, but it's part of our socialization into the role of whiteness that we don't understand it that way. I'm not here to blame anybody or dunk anybody. It's a feature, not a bug, of what we learn from when we're kids. So the human skills are things, just to say, are things like empathy, compassion, kindness, listening, courage, learning how to take action even when we're uncomfortable. Those are human skills that we get to learn, and to the extent that we have them, we get to apply to this issue.
You and I have talked a fair amount about this over the years of our friendship, and one line I remember is discomfort is a tool of oppression, right?
Yes.
If we just are uncomfortable about talking to our white friends about whiteness, like that serves white supremacy, right?
Yes. A lot of times I like to think they're not all.
If it just feels awkward, I don't want to do that. I don't know if I know enough. I don't know if I'll do it right.
Yes. The pull. I mean, these are the other skills, right? We get to learn how to have more comfort around making mistakes. We get to learn comfort around violating social norms. What's unfortunate is when it comes to racial equity, often we'll go to a workshop or a training or something, and we will be invited as white people. You're just going to have to be uncomfortable, and you're going to have to violate this huge social norm. And by the way, we want you to start with the most consequential and difficult thing. We want you to talk to people. We want you to risk relationships with people you love off the bat. And I know you're not comfortable violating certain social norms at all, but we want you to violate this big, huge one right off the bat. And that is an understandable and reasonable request, I have to say, but it is not a realistic request. And so I talk about the work that I do as predicate work. It's like, okay, well, how about the next time you're at Target and someone butts in front of you at line, you actually say something to them? Like, let's practice. Why don't you stand in an elevator and stand backwards? This is Sociology 101, right? Sociology students all across the world really are violating social norms for class projects. And I am inviting people who aren't sociologists to try it, just to see what it feels like to violate a social norm in a less consequential environment. Now, we've got 83 days. We don't have time for everybody to become very comfortable violating the most consequential social norms. That's a longer term project. But for the next 83 days, what I'm trying to do is help people become aware, oh, this is something uncomfortable. We are made to shy away from this discomfort on purpose as white people. It's part of our socialization and conditioning as white people, but it's not who we are as full human beings. As full human beings, we crave connection. We crave seeing other people's full humanity and having our full humanity seen. Racial identity of whiteness goes against that full humanity. It's not designed to nurture the humanness of us. It is designed to get us to treat people of color badly and to accept, mistreatment. So it's an invitation back to full personhood. And practicing that the next 83 days can be useful.
This seems like a really wonderful segue to talk about Minnesota Nice.
Yes.
Because there are no whiter people than the people of Minnesota. I mean, there's a bunch of white people, but you and I know Minnesota really well. You're from Minnesota, former mayor of Minneapolis, and the whiteness is pretty glaring. Although, again, more diverse state than probably people realize, especially the city of Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And also speaking of people who are uncomfortable with discomfort.
Yes.
And that's where kind of Minnesota Nice comes from.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I know that English is not a tonal language, but if it were, the word interesting as used in Minnesota would be evidence that English is a tonal language. Because depending on how it's said, the pauses before and after, whether the first, second, third, or fourth syllables are rising, falling, or flat, interesting means different things.
Could you give us an example? Should you do a little Minnesota to, standard English example?
Oh, so J.D. Vance and his couch. Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
Versus, let's see. Oh, you want me to come to your party? That's interesting.
That is a more and that's like, I might come.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, I see. You put I see you put sardines in your hot dish. That's interesting. That is sure interesting.
But this gets us to Minnesota nice, which has been used a lot to describe Tim Walz because he does seem like a genuinely nice guy. But that's not Minnesota nice.
No. If Minnesota nice is, I won't say it's an insult. It's a descriptor. Minnesota nice is sort of being polite, not speaking your mind, not saying what you mean, but then acting out what you mean without saying a word about it. So one way people have described it is Minnesota nice. You know, Minnesotans will give you directions anywhere in the whole state except their own house.
I've heard it as nice right up until the front door.
Yeah.
So this is interesting way of getting to Tim Walz and his progressive legislation in Minnesota. Yeah. Because it actually followed through, right? Yes. It wasn't Minnesota nice.
Right.
It was actually Minnesota really aggressive.
Yes. I mean, Minnesota nice is passive aggressive. And Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan's agenda for Minnesota.
Yes, let's include Peggy. We have to include Peggy.
Very assertive. They've had a very assertive agenda, but it's only seen as assertive if you think that the bulk of Minnesota didn't want it or it was a big fight, right? And they had to work hard to get done what they've done with the help of great legislative leadership. Shout out to my friend Scott Dibble. But it really is a common sense agenda, and it's an agenda that is built on the legacy of Minnesota's history as understanding that pooling your resources together and deciding how to distribute them on behalf of all Minnesotans means that all Minnesotans will do better. You know, the Minnesota Miracle, which has been chipped away at over time, but the framework and the understanding is still there. They've done remarkable things, and then the results speak for themselves.
Talk about the Minnesota Miracle for a second, for people who don't remember / know.
In the early 1970s, there was a whole set of legislation that came together. It included local government aid, where sales tax dollars are pooled and then redistributed to cities based on need for certain things, so that every city can have streets that are paved well. Every city can have, great public services in a way that smaller cities couldn't afford left to their own devices. There were a whole bunch of elements to the Minnesota Miracle, LGA just being a big one of them. Wendell Anderson, the governor at the time, made the cover of Time magazine, in his flannel plaid with a fish. It was a big deal, but it really set up Minnesota to box above our weight for, generations after that. The outcomes from Minnesota are far better than would have been anticipated given all the other resources we have available to us and given comparable other states. It was a miracle, and it did what it was supposed to do.
Being in Texas now, I sometimes tell people about the services that are available on the county level in Minnesota, including things like detox centers, and it just blows people's mind. That we have mental health and addiction services. Just anyone.
Yeah.
Anyone can have.
Yeah. Yeah. The land of 10,000 rehabs.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's further than that.
Yes.
But that's
the
thing that there's arts also like, what is it in Minneapolis that all the lakefront land has to be public?
Theodore Wirth designed the city so that around almost every lake in the city of Minneapolis, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6.5, 7 lakes in Minneapolis, they all have biking and walking pedestrian paths around the entire circumference. There's 50 miles of protected pedestrian and bikeways, all connected around all the lakes, Minnehaha Creek, up to the Mississippi River. Who knew? Mississippi River is right there in Minneapolis. It's all connected.
And I think this is actually important to transfer to how we're thinking about national politics right now. Like, this is the context where all of that legislation that Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan, cannot forget Peggy, all of that legislation they're getting credit for comes from this very baked in, if you will, idea in Minneapolis and Minnesota that we're in this together.
Yes.
That there is a sense that everyone's welfare depends on everyone else. And that is something that the progressive Midwest used to have as a whole, but it somehow fell out in a lot of other places.
Yes. I mean, 30 degrees below zero in a blizzard helps you value your neighbors in a way that perhaps other things don't.
I like that as a reason why Minnesota works in a way that other states don't, but it gets super cold in the Dakotas and in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about the progressive past, right?
Right. That's true. But why do you think the other Midwestern states haven't seen the same kind of viability for progressive politics? Do you have a thought about that?
I've had many thoughts about it over time. There may be other people to ask who might have more of a sense of that than I do. I do know that the resources that Minnesota has had over time, you know, that we have a combination of agricultural land, the mineral resources, the forestry resources, like all of that together, right, led to, for some reason, the business culture in Minnesota is very civically minded, which is a boon and an asset. There are 19 Fortune 500 companies in Minnesota, but they have been and remain very civically minded relative to other corporate cultures in other states. Why that is? I think historians would know better than I. I can say what the impact of that has been over time, multi-sector support for this idea of we're all in it together. We have argued about what that means over the edges, and there have been definite pushes to pull things apart again. I'm not saying that, but you know, Minnesotans have withstood that and been very clear on their expectations over time.
Let's talk about where this runs back into race.
Yeah.
Because I love to talk about how great Minnesota is, particularly Minneapolis. Also St. Paul. I spent a good deal of time in St. Paul as well. And I love to brag on it. Racial equity history has not been as necessarily vibrant.
Oh, no.
It's not necessarily as good a story.
No.
We've now mentioned Peggy Flanagan a few times. She's amazing. You know Peggy personally, right? Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
She's the first Indigenous person, highest ranking Indigenous person in government today, and will be knocking on my computer, first Indigenous governor. And that's great. But obviously there have been issues. Do you want to talk about how those things run up against each other?
Well, so Minnesota, I'll speak for Minneapolis just because I was the mayor of Minneapolis, has some of the biggest gaps between white people and people of color in the entire country, right? The history of Native oppression in Minnesota is just as bad as it is in other places in the country. The history of and current sort of in aggregate from a sociological perspective, education, income, employment, housing, all of that, people of color are doing far worse than white people are doing in Minnesota, in spite of this progressive identity that Minnesota has, particularly white Minnesota has. Now, part of the reason the gaps are so big is because the systems are very well set up for white people to do well relative to other places. African-American people, for example, are similarly situated in Minneapolis to African-American people in, Atlanta or Portland or Cincinnati, other cities you'd want to name. But white people are doing lots better. There's less poverty among white people, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's part of the reason for the gap, but the gaps are still there. And part of Minnesota nice, and I've seen this myself over and over and over, is, oh, yes, we want to do something about that. And then anytime there's an attempt to do something about that, they quietly object in the voter
I
on
remember
the
some of
ballot.
this about when you were mayor, although we should be clear, you were mayor until 2009.
18. I left office on January 2nd, 2018.
So there's a big piece of this conversation that I want to get to, but that you don't have direct experience with. So,
right.
But that's part of the story. So the Minnesota Nice, and we talked about this while you were mayor, that everyone talks a good game. They're knowledgeable white people, talk a good game, say they're for progressive policies, say they want all this stuff distributed equally, and then get to the voting booth
and then they vote for the person who brings them the most racial comfort. But that, what I've learned is that is a hallmark of whiteness on the left, kind of wherever it finds itself. That one of the features of whiteness that I talk about is we often on the left, center to the left, we want to feel better about race, but we struggle to do better about race because there is the transition trough between what we believe and what it would take to make what we believe happen. And that transition trough includes changes to how business is done right now. And we don't do a great job of articulating for one another as white people what that will do for us. But we do a great job of scaring ourselves by what we think it will do to us.
Yeah. So you had moved to DC by the time the Floyd protest happened. George Floyd died. And all of the things happened in Minneapolis.
Yep.
So to just say what it seems like to me, but you're going to be the one who offers the expertise on this, is that the BLM protests and the uprisings that happened in Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered could have happened anywhere. The tinderbox is about the same size, maybe, as it is anywhere. I do think what happened afterwards might have unfolded a little bit differently than other places. But you have a face that says no.
Well,
says yes. I won't try to read your mind. But
when you say could have unfolded differently, which part?
I mean, that does seem like there were some genuine changes that happened. Not maybe as much as we would dream of, but some. I wonder sometimes if Walls's own trajectory was affected by that.
I would imagine statewide, yes. I will say the voters of Minneapolis the following year voted down. I mean, they decided they wanted more centralized policing and more of it. And they decided they rejected the idea of adding aspects of public safety that would have reduced police violence. I wasn't there for all that. This is not me trying to dunk on anybody who was there trying to make anything happen. But I'm not sure the changes in the city itself reflect what people were hoping for in June of 2020.
And we say what people were hoping for, perhaps that were we referring especially to activists were hoping for?
I would say anybody not living in Minneapolis who wanted something good to happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's easy for people to say, oh, here's what should happen in that city, not necessarily being part of that city. But it was one of those moments, there are these moments where there is more white attention on racial equity and white people step up to the plate and say, oh my gosh, this is something important. I want to be part of this. We're in one of those moments now with Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris running for president. We're in one of those moments, stepping up to the plate and saying, we want things to be different. And that window is usually open for 6 to 18 months after whatever the event is, if we look back over the last about 15 years. And I knew at the time, I was calling colleagues at the time saying, we've got about 6 to 18 months where white people in cities might be willing to make policy changes that actually get better outcomes for people of color instead of policy changes that make white people feel better about race, which are two different things. we have a chance. What should we do? And worked with different clients and different colleagues to try and move some of that policy forward inside that window. And it did indeed shut. I think we can see the backlash that's happened and is happening around the country. But I think we have one of those opening up moments again, which is why I think so many of us are stepping up into it. And the good news is, for me anyway, Vice President Harris running for president is a positive precipitating event, not a negative precipitating event.
I have two things I definitely want to get on the table before we go. One is to cover for sure what white people, maybe especially white women, white female identifying people with female privilege, need to be thinking about in terms of after that conference call, right? After that Zoom call, since we don't have a long, long time to practice standing backwards in elevators and warming up, like what are some actions that we can start taking?
I would say one thing, if people want more information about this,
yes,
you can find me. You can find me online. My website is betsyhodges.com. My Instagram is at Betsy Hodges 11, the number one, Betsy Hodges 11. And if you send me a message and if you say 90 days, right, I can send you a one-pager about here are some things you can do. And I'm also going to be doing more online Zoom classes and things particularly for white women, around what might get in the way of taking the action we know we want to take in the next 83 days. But there's plenty to do. So what I would say is, the number one thing I would say is let yourself be organized. Meaning not organized like organize your house, but if the Harris campaign says we're going to be in your neighborhood door knocking, will you come door knocking? Go door knocking, right? They will teach you how to do it. You'll have somebody to go with you. You just step up to the plate and take the swing, right? And maybe invite a couple friends with you. Like that is not a huge barrier to entry.
As you're saying that, I want to think of two things. One is there is no one simple trick, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, things like door knocking, it really matters. Like things seem like, oh, that I don't have to do that because that's just like how many doors can you knock on in a neighborhood? Like whatever, they can find someone else to hit the 10 houses on my street. But it really does matter. It really, every single fucking door that gets knocked on matters.
The advantage Democrats have over Republicans is we organize this way, but it relies on people showing up to do it. Now, if you haven't done it before or you haven't done it a lot, we are prone to falling into the worst case scenario trap. We imagine every door we knock on, every phone call we make is going to be the most mean, personally attacking, virulent, racist person we've ever talked to in our entire lives. And every call is going to be like that. And the fact of the matter is, I have literally done thousands, if not tens of thousands of these calls and door knocks. And most of the time, almost every time, it's just another human being on the other side of that door. You get to be thoughtful about it. But one, the worst case scenario, not that common. Two, they'll train you. You'll have people with you. They'll train you how to do it. You won't be alone. You don't have to just call up strangers without knowing what to say and hope for the best, right? They have things they want you to talk about. It's fun. It can be very fun.
I will say, the last time I did door knocking was for Elizabeth Warren. And I did do it alone because so few people showed up. So, personal plea from me who had to do it by myself. If you go, one more person won't have to do it by themselves. That's just one more person that gets to have someone with them. And my experience with door knocking was most of the people just didn't answer the door.
Most people don't answer the phone. Most people don't answer the door.
But everyone that did answer the door, was in Minneapolis. So like nice, like everyone was nice.
Yeah.
So, and also most of the time, I think with door knocking, which I think is super, super effective when you get someone at the door, it's hard to be mean to someone that shows up and is knocking on your door. Like,
yeah, I don't want to be unrealistic. It's not impossible.
yeah.
Right. But I was also knocking on the door as candidate, so people sometimes had a lot to say. But the campaign is also savvy enough they're not having you go to every door. They're not going to have you go to identified Trump supporters' doors. There's no reason to spend that energy. They're going to have you go to the doors of people who might be persuaded to vote, or once you get into the get out the vote season, who we just want to make sure they go to the polls.
I want to also plug Beto O'Rourke's yesterday was on the show and also talked about his Powered by People organization, which trains people to register voters here in Texas and facilitates like one-to-one relationships with new voters. And that's a great way to be involved, perhaps a little bit more intensive than just knocking on doors, but just knocking on doors totally counts. And then also, before we turn over to kind of last thoughts, I want to mention you have referred to global majority, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think most people are used to hearing people of color, BIPOC, Black,
yes.
Brown. That's your preference for that container of people. I'm trying to think of the right word. And Kamala Harris, I mean, because she is Black, and we usually talk about her being Black. She did not just turn Black, contra Trump.
Bless his heart.
She is multiracial. Like she is not just Black. She is a multi-ethnic, multiracial. Right. Is that an important part of the discussion?
I think it's important to recognize that. I think people are getting more savvy about recognizing that on the supporter side. They're finding creative ways to weaponize it on the non-supporter side. I'll just put it that way. They've been gearing up they have the tools of racism available to them. And I think it's occurring to some people that the tools of anti-Blackness are very powerful, but the tools of anti-Asian racism also have cachet, and let's use all those tools available to us. So we, as supporters, get to, one, become savvy about what that racism looks like, what those tools of racism look like, and we get to celebrate all the great things that Vice President Harris brings to will bring to the White House, has already brought to the White House, frankly, and will continue to bring the country, including her racial heritages, are incredibly valuable.
Let's go backwards in time just a little bit, because we're talking about the difference that Kamala Harris will make. But how did Kamala Harris's election make a difference in the way that we think about racial and ethnic identity?
I mean, it did create an entirely new racial imagination for people in the country to have a Black and South Asian vice president in the country. I mean, I remember sitting with
a woman. I also think a female.
Yeah, and a woman.
Black
right.
and South Asian.
Yes. I remember, when I got married to my husband, I became grandmother to 4 African heritage kids. And I remember Luke in particular was very young at the time. He would have been 4 maybe. And watching that half-hour ad that Barack Obama did, that the campaign did right before the election about his life. And every time a different picture of Barack Obama would come up, Luke would say, "Who's that?" And I would say, "That's Barack Obama. He's going to be our next president of the United States." And understanding that was the first time those neural pathways could legitimately be created in the brain of a young child, let alone a young Black child in this country. Right? And so imagine a Black South Asian woman is the vice president of the United States, and it's been very normalized for the last 4 years, to the extent that a party known for creating internecine chaos in a vacuum of leadership was able to immediately rally around her. Now, I know a lot of work went into that at the same time, but still, right? The Democrat tendency toward chaos was stilled in the face of, well, of course, she's great. She's been doing great work. She's a great candidate. Let's go there. That's in part because millions and millions and millions of neural pathways were created seeing a woman of color in that role for 4 years.
So Betsy, I'll give you another chance. I want people to know that I fully endorse and want people to contact you about this one-pager for white women. And they would get it by going to your website, which is betsyhodges.com.
Yes.
Or messaging you on Instagram, which is at Betsy Hodges 11. And they should do that if you are already a white lady supporting Kamala Harris and you're like, all right, I did it. Well, maybe there's a little bit more. Maybe there's some things you should be thinking about.
Or you want thoughts about why white women around you might be struggling.
There you go. You are my friend. You are the former mayor of Minneapolis and currently a writer and consultant about white people and racial equity.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a delight, Anna. I always love talking to you on or off a microphone.
And it is 90 days, like the show, and then actually 83 days. Go register, go door knock. Thank you so much. Bye. You can listen to 90 Days as a podcast wherever you get your podcast, or you can continue watching it if you're watching it here on YouTube, like, subscribe, etc. Please.